Even though the rules for flanking are optional in 5th edition and buried deep inside the Dungeon Master's Guide, many tables make use of them. Unfortunately, the rules outlined in the Dungeon Master's Guide leave some things to be desired, and there's some easy fixes we can make to improve 5th edition's flanking system. Hey everybody, and welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're going to talk about the failings of 5th edition's flanking system, as well as a simple homebrew version that you can use that fixes those issues. I'll be taking you step by step through the homebrewing process so you understand all of the rationale behind my changes, and so you can apply these principles to your own homebrew. Now, to get started, let's talk about how the default flanking rules work in 5th edition. If two creatures are adjacent to an enemy and on opposite sides of that enemy, they gain advantage on all melee attack rolls against that creature. Now, the first issue with this is that in a party with two melee characters, this is going to make it extremely easy to get advantage and invalidate a lot of class abilities. A lot of these class or ability-based ways to gain advantage require either a tactical trade-off or some sort of expenditure of resources. Using the flanking rules as written means that both of those kind of go out the window, as flanking is almost always going to be easier. Why spend a first level spell to cast Fairy Fire when you can just use your movement to move next to an enemy? With flanking in play, barbarians have less reason to attack recklessly, samurai fighters lose a lot of the appeal of their subclass, and knocking a creature prone is suddenly much less worthwhile. The Wolf Totem subclass of the Barbarian might as well not get a class ability at level 3, and the Pack Tactics ability that some monsters have access to is also made almost completely worthless by this. Our next issue with flanking is that because it uses advantage, it doesn't stack with any other source of advantage. A creature that is both flanked and prone is just as easy to hit as a character that is simply prone. This kind of builds on the previous issue, where if you have a creature flanked, you have no reason to expend more resources to gain more advantage because you can't get more. That's just how 5th edition works. Our final, fairly minor issue is that it's much easier to flank a large creature than it is to flank a medium-sized creature. A larger creature has more adjacent squares, which means it's much easier to flank it, because normally a medium creature might be hard to flank because there's other creatures near it or terrain. For a larger creature, that's usually not the case because there's just such a wealth of squares to choose from. Now that we know what we don't like about flanking, we need to think about what we want flanking to accomplish, and in this case it's pretty simple because flanking is a fairly self-explanatory rule. We want it so that if two characters are adjacent to and on opposite sides of an enemy, that enemy is easier to hit with melee attacks. With that in mind, let's look at our options. Normally there's 3 ways to make it easier to hit a creature. Give the attack roll advantage, provide a bonus to the attack roll, or provide a penalty to the creature's armor class. Obviously, we don't want to use the advantage option. Of the other 2, I would lean towards a penalty to the creature's AC for a few reasons. 1, there's a bit of a precedent for conditional armor class modifiers in the form of cover. A creature behind half cover gets +2 to their armor class, and a creature behind 3/4 cover gets +5 to their armor class. The other reason I prefer this option is that it's a little bit easier to simply lower a creature's armor class in your head as opposed to change the attack roll bonus for every single attack against a creature. Since we're already using cover as a bit of a baseline, let's continue down that path. A creature with half cover gets a +2 bonus to their armor class, so let's say that a creature that is flanked takes a -2 penalty to its armor class against all melee attacks. While a -2 penalty to AC is typically going to be weaker than advantage, it still provides a substantial benefit and is going to make a character hit much more consistently. A penalty to the enemy's armor class also stacks well with advantage and ensures that characters will both want to flank and use their other sources of providing advantage. Just to simplify things even more, instead of having it so that players are flanking an enemy, we're just going to change it so that enemies get flanked instead. Because it only affects the character being flanked, it makes sense to have flanked as a status condition rather than something that your characters are doing, and in my experience it makes it a little bit easier to track on the board, at least mentally. The big benefit here though is that because flanked is a condition, we can play around with it a little bit on the DM side. Creatures that don't face any particular direction, like a gelatinous ooze, or a creature that could face every direction at the same time, like a Hydra or Tiamat, might be immune to the flanked condition. It's a small thing, but it makes enemies feel a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more alive. Now, with that, let's take a short break and look at our new flanking rules, or rather our flanked condition. With this, we've solved our major issues with flanking while not really impacting our mental workload level. Unfortunately, fixing our next problem, making it so that flanking a larger creature is more difficult than flanking a smaller creature, will require that we make this simple system a little more complicated. Now, there's two ways we can go with this. One is that larger creatures can only be flanked by creatures of the same size as them, or two, that you simply require more creatures to flank a larger creature. Requiring creatures of a certain size in order to flank an enemy doesn't feel great for the players, because for the most part they don't have good ways to get a large number of the party to bigger than medium size. Because of this, let's simply require that more creatures need to be adjacent to larger enemies in order to flank them. Let's just go with a simple one additional creature needed to flank per size category above medium a creature is. So a large creature would require 3, a huge creature would require 4, and a gargantuan creature would require 5. The next issue is that opposite sides gets a little bit harder to define when there's more than 2 creatures. So let's just say that a creature is flanked if it has that number of creatures adjacent to it with at least one pair of them on opposite sides of the creature. And that should solve our issue of larger creatures being easier to flank. Even though a large creature has a lot more adjacent squares, requiring 3 characters to flank them means that it's going to be a bit harder and require a little more effort to flank giants and things like that. Now, while adding our last rule, you might have noticed one small issue. It's really hard for larger creatures to flank a creature of equivalent size to them. With our current rules as they're written now, it would require 3 large creatures to flank a large creature, which doesn't make much sense and gets a lot more complicated. For this, we're just going to go with the simple fix of allowing larger creatures to count as multiple creatures. We'll go with a simple +1 creature for each size above medium, so a large creature counts as 2, a huge creature counts as 3, and a gargantuan creature counts as 4 for the purpose of flanking. We'll add one quick clause that just states that regardless of the size of adjacent enemies, there always needs to be at least 2 independent adjacent enemies to constitute flanking, just to clear up any confusion and make sure that people don't ever get in their head that a large creature can flank a medium creature on its own. And with that, we have our new flanking rule. To recap, rather than providing advantage to the attackers, a creature that is flanked gets a flat penalty to their armor class, and in addition, we solved the issue of larger creatures being easier to flank by requiring more enemies to flank a larger creature, but in turn, we allow larger creatures to count as more characters for the purpose of flanking. These are the flanking rules that I've been using in my own game, and depending on whether or not your party has easy access to advantage, it's either going to be more or less powerful than the typical 5th edition flanking rules. For a party that doesn't have reliable access to advantage in one form or another, this is probably going to be a bit weaker. But for a party that can easily give themselves advantage, this is a significant buff as flanking stacks with their sources of advantage. This also makes enemies with pack tactics that swarm in large groups much more dangerous, as even a character with a high armor class is going to take some damage when their armor class is reduced and they're attacked at advantage. Hopefully walking you through the process of creating the house rule step by step was also helpful, both to let you understand the rationale behind my decisions and help inform your own house rules in the future. The 2 principles that you're going to want to keep in mind are to A, keep the house rules as simple as possible to not overcomplicate the game, and B, use existing rules when possible as a baseline just to try to keep your house rules a bit more balanced. If you enjoyed this video and want to see me cover more of the house rules that I use at my table in the future, please leave a like and let me know in the comments. Either way, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum and have a great day.